So I want to kick off a conversation about insurgency and counterinsurgency and some of the asymmetric conflicts that the United States has been involved in over the last 50, 60 years, and try to understand why those conflicts maybe look differently than conventional conflicts or conventional wars fought between states with conventional militaries. And so for this conversation, we'll review Roy and Toft's How the Weak Win Wars, which is a really fantastic article published a couple decades ago in International Security. It's also very readable, so if you can get your hands on a copy, it's a great article. And so he begins with sort of this puzzle of, we have all these sort of anecdotes of weaker powers, weaker actors, rebel groups defeating much stronger foes. And that's maybe a little bit puzzling because we normally assume that the power of a state correlates to their ability to make war, and in theory, the power of a state should be a good proxy for how likely a state is to win in these conflicts. And we can maybe think about the potential power of states, large population, or sort of the more active and mobilized power, the soldiers in uniform. But regardless, there should be some sort of correlation there. That just seems intuitive, that just as a basic matter, if a conflict is initiated and the stronger side with more potential power starts losing, they should be able to mobilize. Russia mobilizing against Ukraine with a partial or borderline full mobilization, or even thinking about the U.S. Civil War with the Confederacy sort of holding its own against the North until mobilization of the population and of the North's industrial capacity reached a point that Grant was essentially able to grind down the Confederate Army and bring that sort of overwhelming potential power turned into actual military power to bear on the South. That's sort of the story we would expect, but that story doesn't actually seem to work anymore. It certainly was a good predictor. The potential power and actual power of a state was a good predictor of victory in the 19th century, but since the end of World War II, consistently we see weaker powers defeating stronger powers, and Toft has sort of a measure that he uses for thinking about it, whether a conflict is asymmetric in terms of the power of the actors, and he uses the correlates of war composite index of national capacity or capabilities, and sort of says, well, if there's a 5-to-1 ratio, then clearly this is a conflict involving a stronger party and a weaker party. And since the end of World War II, that relationship between power and victory has broken down. And in fact, kind of weirdly, counterintuitively, the greater the power disparity, the more lopsided the conflict, the more likely the weaker side is to win, which is really bizarre, and I think requires a little bit of investigation. Maybe it's bizarre in terms of the theory, but I guess I should also flag that it's not bizarre in terms of experience. Certainly in the United States, Vietnam as the classic example of this, of the United States having recently won World War II, gets fought to a standstill in Korea, and then essentially loses in Vietnam after a decade plus of trying. I think some folks might adjust that and say, well, maybe now Afghanistan is the quintessential case, but I'm not actually convinced about that. The United States, I don't think, actually lost militarily in Afghanistan. The U.S. phased control over to the Afghan military, which couldn't function without active and direct U.S. support, whether it was militarily or symbolically. Whereas in Vietnam, the United States was actively engaged in the fight and really never was in a position to hand off military operations to the Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese military. We'll talk about the Vietnamese war in a little bit here, but first I want to run through Toft's argument to kind of understand sort of what's going on here. And so Toft thinks that he can explain why the weak, or how weak powers, weak actors, are able to defeat stronger actors by thinking about a typology of approaches that states or rebel groups or actors in conflict can take. And so he argues that both the stronger side and the weaker side can engage in direct or indirect strategies. And so the stronger side, we're assuming, is the side that's engaging in attack, and so they can engage in direct attack, right? They're attempting to capture strategic positions that have value, trying to hold cities, trying to hold the transport hubs, and they're attacking enemy forces, right? They're trying to destroy armies in the field. So direct attack versus indirect attack, where you essentially try to break an adversary's will to fight by engaging in barbarism. You target the civilian population. So you can think about in World War II, Nazi Germany's sort of mass bombing of Britain, trying to convince Britain that it should withdraw its engagement from World War II under that kind of pressure that wasn't aimed at really defeating Britain militarily. It was aimed at increasing the pain that Britain was feeling by targeting its civilian population. Typically, I would say that this kind of strategy, whether it was the Nazi blitz on London or whether it was the firebombing campaign waged by the United States against Japan, tends to be considered a violation of the rules of war, that you should not be directly targeting civilians. And that is, military attacks should be limited to targets of military value under international humanitarian law. But nonetheless, we see these two different approaches being used in conflict by the stronger side. We can also think about the options available to the weaker side as direct defense, using their military forces to attack the stronger side's military forces, taking positions of value. I think probably the most effective example of this, in which a weaker party has used this against a stronger party, is Ukraine's strategy of corrosion that it's used against Russia in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where Ukraine has targeted the logistics infrastructure of Russia, taking out trucks and taking out rail hubs and hitting ammo dumps, all with the goal of just sort of making it so that Russia can't support its troops in the field, and those troops become effectively incapable of conducting military operations because they're not getting ammunition, they're not getting food, and their ability to hold kind of crumbles. And so that corrosion strategy might be an example of direct defense, where you're targeting military targets to try to defeat the stronger party. You can also engage in indirect defense, which is typically understood as guerrilla warfare, right? Where you're not actually targeting, you might be targeting military targets, but you're never engaging in direct battle. It's hit and run attacks, it's roadside bombs, and it's always done in a way where it's almost impossible for the stronger side to bring its superior military force to bear on any sort of sizable buildup of military forces. And so the thinking with this kind of approach is that you're never going to defeat a stronger power with guerrilla warfare, but you might drag the conflict on, increase pain to the point where the adversary decides this isn't worth continuing the fight, and the stronger side essentially gives up rather than enduring additional cuts in a death of 1,000 cuts metaphor. I think that works. Okay, so Toft's argument is not just that we have sort of these two different approaches that can be taken by the stronger side and by the weaker side, but he argues that when both parties are using the same type of strategy, direct countering direct or indirect countering indirect, that things tend to favor the stronger side. But when there's a mismatch, when one party is using a direct strategy and another party is using an indirect strategy, that tends to favor the weaker side. I think I've got that right. And so it's that mismatching of strategies that essentially prevents the stronger side from really being able to bring its full capacity to bear in an effective way. It results in the conflict dragging on longer than maybe you would expect, and that in turn leads to the stronger side getting frustrated and then withdrawing from the conflict. That sort of death by 1,000 cuts guerrilla warfare kind of logic comes into play, but it really happens anytime when there's a mismatch of strategies and the stronger side becomes frustrated by the fact that it's not winning decisively. So Toft attempts to test this empirically So he goes to the correlates of war data, and he goes through and codes it in terms of whether the conflict participants were engaging in the same kind of approach, direct attack versus indirect versus direct defense, or they're using an opposite approach. One is using a direct approach, one is using an indirect approach. And what he finds is that when they're both using the same strategy, 76% of the time, the stronger side is favored to win. And when they're using the opposite approach, 63% of the time, almost a 2-to-1 advantage goes to the weaker side, suggesting that really something is going on with the kind of tactics and strategies that are being used to determine why stronger sides don't win decisively. And then he sort of shifts into thinking about the Vietnam case. And I'm going to highlight, I think he does a really good job here about showing how this can work. But I will highlight that his Vietnam case kind of undercuts his nice bar chart, because he shows that over the course of a conflict, the kind of strategy that both the stronger side and the weaker side employ can change. And so I'm not 100% convinced about his coding here as being perfect, but I think it's worth talking through the different phases of the Vietnam War from the perspective of the United States. And so initially the United States engages in an indirect attack against a direct attack or a direct defense. So the North Vietnamese are mobilized militarily in sort of a conventional force, and the United States tries to respond to that by a campaign of rolling thunder, basically bombing military targets in the north and trying to defeat the North by convincing them that they're not going to be able to carry on, that this is too painful. I've heard one statistic, I think from McNamara cites this, saying that the United States dropped more bombs on North Vietnam as part of Rolling Thunder than were dropped in all of World War II, which seems ridiculous, but gives you a sense of the scale of this indirect campaign that doesn't have an effect of breaking the North, but does lengthen the war, because the United States is not actively engaged in the conflict until you get sort of this main force units war phase, in which the United States deploys a large enough force into Vietnam that suddenly it's taking on the conventional forces of the North Vietnamese and defeats them fairly effectively, to the point where the North Vietnamese withdraw most of their presence in South Vietnam and stop trying to strike at the South with conventional forces, with the exception of the Tet Offensive, which is launched near the end. It actually does have a fairly decisive effect on public opinion in the United States, convincing the United States, the American public, that the conflict is nowhere near over, and that North Vietnam still has considerable offensive capabilities left to fight a conventional war. So, but nonetheless, Toft thinks that has the effect of shortening the war, that it looks like the North Vietnamese are being defeated by engaging directly with the United States. And so they shift into a guerrilla war, in which the United States continues to be operating with sort of conventional military forces in Vietnam, but now they're being attacked by guerrilla forces in the South, and the United States has to figure out how to respond to that, and shifts to first maybe, I don't want to call it hearts and minds, but I will call it a hearts and minds counterinsurgency strategy of trying to work with local village defense forces, doing an ink blot strategy where they seize control of a village and then work with the village to provide local security, and then patrol out from that village in an ever expanding, I guess, ink blot kind of pattern, until they sort of intersect with other villages that are going through the same process. And the thinking is that this is going to provide security for the civilian population. We'll talk about why that's so essential later on when we talk about counterinsurgency strategy. But for a variety of reasons, Toft says that this wasn't as effective as it might have been, and the United States shifts to a indirect approach, not exactly barbarism in the way that we saw earlier, but something maybe similar. And so he highlights two sort of indirect strategies that the United States employs. One is the Strategic Hamlets program, in which the United States recognizes that it can't effectively control different villages in South Vietnam, and so it forcibly relocates people to new villages back within territory that the United States feels it can actually control, to move them away from where they can support or be terrorized by North Vietnamese aligned guerrilla fighters. And so this ends up being an incredibly horrific campaign, destroying communities in an attempt to secure the countryside. The other part of this campaign is a Operation Phoenix, which is a assassination campaign that is waged against the leadership of the guerrilla networks operating in South Vietnam. The thinking is that these are networks and that you can destroy them by targeting the key nodes in those networks, and that was done through assassination of people, which ends up being fairly controversial because you're targeting people who maybe appear in their daily life as civilians, even though they're critical to sustaining a guerrilla infrastructure. Okay, so Toft has this story about how the conflict ends up evolving. Actors keep reacting to each other, but the end result is that the United States engages in the kind of barbarism that is unpalatable to the American public, and as a result, the American public kind of turns against the war. And this ends up being a really important part of Toft's argument, and he's building on some work that's been done, I think decades before that, by Andrew Mack, looking at the French operation in Algeria, and how you can be effective with barbarism, but there will be a domestic backlash against that, particularly within democracies, and as a result, you can't sustain that kind of campaign effectively, and so the public turns against the war, and as a result, the United States has to withdraw, and France has to withdraw from Algeria. I think we need to dig into that and look at that a little bit more, and I think we will. But I would also flag that this is connecting back to a larger conversation that has really been in the background of a lot of U.S. Security and strategic thinking over the last 40, 50 years, which is who's to blame for the U.S. failure in Vietnam. The military wants to argue that it was never defeated militarily, that it was doing things effectively, and that it was adapting to what the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese guerrilla forces were throwing at it, and it was the civilian population, it was the hippies and the anti-war movement that weren't willing to support those kind of operations and make the sacrifices needed to really win the conflict. I'm not sure that that's actually true, and I think that in a democracy, you typically need to fight within the constraints of what the civilian population is willing to allow, and I think one of the things that we've seen since the end of Vietnam is that while the military maybe doesn't want to acknowledge that it was not able to defeat North Vietnam and the South Vietnamese guerrilla movement, that blaming the public isn't necessarily the right way to resolve that, because you do need to work with the public and you do need to maintain public support. And so I think that criticism from the perspective of the military hasn't just been a way to cover up for failure. It has become a guiding principle in how the military thinks about military operations and what it can and cannot do and what it can and cannot sustain in thinking about how to carry out operations in the future.